November 1942. I still remember the letters written by exhausted Marines who had survived the fighting on Guadalcanal. One in particular described a night raid so chilling that even decades later, historians whisper about it as though the shadows might still be listening. The letter begins with a trembling line. They came out of the darkness like ghosts, and one of them had a pistol that looked cheap enough to buy in a toy shop. But God, the way he used it, that was the first time I encountered the phrase $5 Japanese pistol. At first glance, it sounded like crude wartime mockery, the kind soldiers use to soothe their own fear. But as I began digging deeper into diaries, captured ordnance reports, and testimonies from both American and Australian forces, it became clear that something far stranger was at play. This so-called $5 pistol, crude and almost laughable in appearance, had earned a terrifying reputation across the Pacific. Not because of its elegance, nor its craftsmanship, no, far from it. It was feared for reasons far more psychological, far more primal, and far more unpredictable. What fascinated me most was how consistently this weapon appeared across the Pacific front. In the steaming jungles of Burma, Australian commandos wrote about its tin toy rattle. In the caves of Saipan, American Marines noted how it seemed to crack like a snapped bone. And throughout the islands, captured Japanese officers often carried them not as symbols of authority, but as instruments of last-ditch defiance. Yet despite its cheapness lied, intelligence officers joked it was worth no more than $5 Yankee dollars. It had an aura that caused even hardened soldiers to hesitate. The mystery thickened when I studied early Pacific War reports from 1941 and 1942. Allied analysts frequently dismissed Japanese small arms as poorly made, underpowered, and technically backward. The pistols were especially mocked thin, awkward, oddly proportioned, with grips that looked closer to a child's wooden toy than a military sidearm. But the battlefield is not a showroom, and what matters in combat isn't aesthetics, it's consequence. And these pistols, despite their flaws, created consequences that etched themselves into the memories of anyone who faced them. I remember reading a British description of a captured Japanese officer on Singapore Island. He held a pistol that looked as though it had been hammered from scrap metal. Yet the surrounding Gurkhas approached him with caution, as if he carried a viper in his hand. Why? Why would Allied troops fear a sidearm dismissed as little more than a cheap trinket? Why did this ugly, rattling object inspire such unease? To understand the truth, one must go back decades before the Pacific erupted into war. Japan, in the late 1920s and 1930s, was caught in a whirlwind of militarization, industrial strain, and rapid expansion. Their armies were growing faster than their factories could support, and their officers demanded more pistols than Japan could reasonably produce. Resources were stretched, steel was rationed, and the nation's industry still. Modernizing was struggling beneath the weight of militaristic ambition. So Japan turned to a philosophy quite alien to Western doctrine: produce something simple, cheap, functional, and good enough. The result was a family of pistols, primarily the Type 14 and Type 94, with various earlier Nambu models still in circulation. That did not look intimidating and did not meet the quality standards of their American or European counterparts. But they were inexpensive to make, quick to assemble, and surprisingly effective when used at point-blank range, which is where most jungle encounters occurred. This, I soon realized, was the heart of the matter. These pistols were not designed for show. They were not crafted to win admiration. They were forged for a brutal style of warfare: close, sudden, intimate violence where a gun didn't need to be beautiful. It just needed to fire. And therein lay the irony. The pistol the Allies mocked for its cheapness became the pistol they later feared for its presence in the dark, the fog, and the silence. I traveled to military museums and private collections to examine surviving Japanese pistols myself. When I first held one, the myths suddenly made sense. The weapon felt wrong in the handtop, heavy, cold, with awkward finger grooves that didn't align with Western ergonomics. Its metal was thin, stamped, almost crude. But when I pulled back the bolt and felt the internal mechanics snap into place, I understood the design philosophy. It was not built for comfort. It was built for inevitability. The 8.22mm Nambu cartridge, HOF, dismissed as weak, was still lethal at the close ranges typical of jungle. Warfare 5, 10, 15 feet. And the Japanese officers trained exhaustively in its close-quarter use. In the darkness, at arm's reach, a single shot from this supposedly $5 pistol could and often did decide life or death. One of the most chilling accounts I read was from a U.S. Marine on Peleliu. He described clearing a bunker where he encountered a Japanese officer kneeling in the shadows, motionless. The officer did not raise his head, did not speak. But in his hand, barely visible, was the unmistakable silhouette of a Japanese pistol. The Marine wrote, "I froze. I didn't know if it would jam or misfire. But I knew if he squeezed first, it was over." The irony was that Allied soldiers did not fear the pistol because it was powerful. They feared it because it was unpredictable. The Type 94, especially, had a notorious exposed sear on its side. Press it the wrong way, and the weapon could fire without the trigger being pulled. Soldiers told stories of Japanese officers pressing the side plate with their palm during suicide charges, even if half dead from shrapnel or shock. They could still fire the weapon simply by applying pressure. Against the frame, one Marine described it as a pistol that could kill you before the man. Holding it even realized he was dead. That is the kind of fear that burrows into a soldier's mind and never leaves. As the war progressed, Allied intelligence learned to respect these weapons. Reports shifted from mockery to caution. Soldiers began recognizing the thin silhouette of the Nambu pistols as a sign that the enemy was either preparing to fight to the last breath or to take their own life rather than surrender. This psychological transformation changed the way troops approached caves, bunkers, and captured officers. A Japanese soldier with a rifle might surrender. A Japanese soldier with a pistol almost never would. During the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, this became painfully evident. Marines clearing tunnels reported that the presence of a Japanese pistol often meant the man holding it was waiting in silence, ready to fire at point-blank range the moment a Marine's shadow crossed the cave mouth. In such confined darkness, even a weak pistol bullet could tear through flesh, bone, and hope. Yet there was another layer to this fear, one rooted in sheer unpredictability. The Japanese pistols, especially late-war models, suffered from the same industrial desperation that plagued Germany's last-ditch Volkssturm weapons. Metal quality varied. Springs weakened. Bolts rattled. In some cases, the pistols fired out of battery. But this very unreliability created a terrifying psychological effect. American soldiers could never be sure what the pistol would do. Would it misfire? Would it explode? Would it go off accidentally during a struggle? The weapon became something like a rabid dog in the hands of its own or a dangerous knot because of its precision. But because of its volatility, I found a particularly disturbing account from an Australian patrol in New Guinea. They ambushed a small Japanese scouting party. In the chaos, one Australian soldier grappled with an officer armed with one of these pistols. The officer, already mortally wounded, squeezed the weapon in desperation. It fired not once, but twice simply from pressure on the frame as they rolled in the mud. The Australian survived, barely. He later wrote, "I thought the damned thing had a mind of its own." But perhaps the most iconic moment involving a Japanese pistol came during the Battle of Saipan, when Admiral Nagumo, one of Japan's most respected commanders, chose suicide rather than capture. He used his own service pistol. And the Marines who discovered him described the scene with an unsettling mixture of respect and dread. The pistol lay beside him, still warm. One Marine wrote, "It looked cheap." But it had just ended the life of the man who started Pearl Harbor. From that moment on, the psychological association deepened. The pistol was no longer just a sidearm. It became a symbol of fanatic resistance, of death chosen over surrender, of a foe unwilling to yield even when surrounded. And so the $5 Japanese pistol, once mocked, became a dark icon of the Pacific War. When I compare it to American or British sidearms, such as the M1911 or the Webley Mk6, the differences are stark. The American Colt .45 was a powerhouse, heavy, reliable, deadly. The British Webley was a masterpiece of mechanical simplicity. German pistols like the Luger and Walther P38 had engineering pedigree. By contrast, the Japanese pistols looked flimsy, sounded flimsy, and in technical terms often were flimsy. But warfare is not a competition of beauty, not a contest of machining pride. It is the sum of human fear, expectation, experience, and survival instinct. And on that battlefield, the psychological battlefield, Japanese pistols punched far above their weight as the war neared its close. Japan's desperation became reflected in the weapons themselves. Late-war Nambu pistols were often made with poor steel, rushed machining, and loose tolerances. Allied soldiers who captured them joked they wouldn't trust the gun not to explode in their own hands. And yet, even then, the fear remained, because when a weapon is used by a man determined to die before surrendering, the cost of underestimating it is unbearably high. In Okinawa, an American platoon clearing a network of trenches encountered a lone Japanese lieutenant. He stood at the far end, pistol raised. The Marines paused. They could have rushed him. They could have fired. But they didn't, because every one of them knew the lieutenant would fire even if set ablaze. He would fire even if shot. He would fire even if the pistol misfired and blew apart in his hand. A moment of hesitation cost the platoon sergeant his life. Only after the war did survivors understand why they hesitated at all. The pistol had become a symbol of certain death. When Japan finally surrendered in 1945, mountains of these pistols were captured. American soldiers brought them home as souvenirs, often laughing at their awkward shapes and rattling innards. And yet, on the battlefield, those same pistols had caused them to tread lightly, to aim carefully, to wait in silence before entering a cave. It is easy, in hindsight, to mock a weapon. It is harder to acknowledge the dread it once inspired. Today, when I hold one in a museum, the metal cold against my hand, I can almost feel the weight of history pressing through it. I see the officer who carried it into a final charge, the Marine who froze at the sight of it in the dark, the Australian who wrestled with it in the mud. I see fear, resolve, desperation, and death all contained in a weapon worth $5 in wartime mockery, but far more in actual consequence. And that, I realize, is the paradox. The $5 Japanese pistol was not feared because it was good. It was feared because of what it represented: a cheap tool wielded with terrifying conviction, a symbol of a fighting force that refused to surrender, and a reminder that in war, even the simplest weapon can cast the longest shadow. Its true power was never in its metal. Its true power was in the hands that held it, and that is why this little, rattling, awkward, unpredictable pistol, dismissed by Allied analysts, mocked by soldiers, cheap enough to be called a toy, became one of the most feared sidearms in the Pacific, not for its craftsmanship, not for its technology, but because on those islands, in that darkness, it meant something far more chilling. The man holding it had no intention of leaving the battlefield alive.